From the very start, it was meant to be a gate of peace, an open gate, crowned by Irene, the Greek goddess of peace, driving a chariot. But the message of peace failed to deter conquerors and dictators. First came Napoleon, then Hitler. 12 years later, in the battle for Berlin, the gate was damaged. The Quadriga on top, the chariot and 4 horses, was almost destroyed. It was replaced during the Cold War, and soon thereafter the Brandenburg Gate would be sealed, and for 28 years would remain a gate blocked by a wall. Until one November evening, when everything was transformed. Occasionally, the right thing does happen in history. Whenever history was made in Germany, the key events took place at the Brandenburg Gate. For decades, it was a symbol of Germany's division. When the Berlin Wall came down, it became a symbol of German unity. No one knows better than the goddess on top of the gate just how long and hard the road was to reach that point. In 1786, the Brandenburg Gate was one of 18 gates to the city. Whoever wanted to enter Berlin from the west had to pass through it. It was a modest Baroque construction, practical and simple, in the Prussian manner favored by Friedrich the Great. Old Fritz had no children and was succeeded by his nephew Friedrich William II, who, unlike his uncle, loved pomp and splendor. He'd had a new main road built to Charlottenburg and Potsdam in the west, and he wanted a new and grander town gate to match. He wanted it built at once. The commission went to the architect Carl Gotthard Langhans, who was building the Royal Opera House and was a fan of neoclassicism, which had just come into fashion. Langhans's design was modeled closely on the Propylaea, the gateway to the Acropolis in Athens. On top of the gate there was to be a quadriga, a chariot bearing a female figure and 4 horses, designed by the sculptor Johann Gottfried Schadow. The charioteer, a goddess in beaten copper, was only hoisted into position in 1793. At first she was naked, though not for long. Still, the Berliners soon took a liking to her. On December the 23rd of that year, the first grand event took place at the Brandenburg Gate. It was a joyous occasion. The arrival of the young Princess Luise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who was betrothed to the Crown Prince. Later, as queen, she would be adored by the people of Berlin. But the 1790s were stormy times. The French Revolution was not at all to the liking of the Prussian kings. Most of the troops that set off through the Brandenburg Gate to wage war would never return. In 1799, the Corsican general Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France and declared himself first consul. He soon turned half of Europe into a battlefield. In 1806, the peace-loving Prussian king Friedrich William III abandoned his policy of neutrality and joined the war against France. But at the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, his poorly trained army was routed by the French. On October the 27th, the victorious Napoleon entered Berlin through the Brandenburg Gate, where the city elders presented him with the keys to the city. The Quadriga atop the gate caught his greedy eye. He promptly had the goddess, her chariot and horses taken down, packed into 24 crates and shipped to Paris. They traveled by sea from Hamburg to Rotterdam, and the entire journey took 6 months. But once in Paris, there was nowhere to put the Quadriga, so it went into storage. For 8 years, the forlorn Brandenburg Gate had to do without them. The abduction of their goddess engendered for the very first time something like patriotic sentiment among the people of Berlin. Some may have secretly admired Napoleon, but stealing their Nike was inexcusable. In 1814, a convoy of wagons drawn by 32 horses brought the goddess home again, reaching Berlin in June. This after the Battle of Leipzig the previous autumn had delivered a massive blow to Napoleon. After the turmoil came the tranquil bourgeois Biedermeier period. What would the Brandenburg Gate be without the boulevard that stretches east from its base, Unter den Linden? The city's main thoroughfare was also the place for the military to march up and down, and for burghers and aristocrats to stroll, to meet, talk, and flirt. This period is often considered to have been the good old days. It was, however, also a period of political reaction and censorship, of a complacent bourgeoisie and self-absorbed merchant class. There were precious few signs of intellectual or cultural vigor. At the same time, the years between 1815 and 1845 were the most peaceful the city and the Brandenburg Gate ever saw during the past 2 centuries. By March 1848, the mood in the country had turned. A political opposition had emerged, demanding freedom of assembly, speech, and the press. On the 13th of March, 10,000 demonstrators marched down Unter den Linden to present their demands to the king. Troops were waiting for them at the Brandenburg Gate. Fighting erupted when the soldiers tried to disperse the crowd. Almost 200 people were killed. The king was forced to make concessions to prevent further bloodshed, and as a sign of his goodwill, he carried the black, red, and gold flag of freedom as he rode through the city. 2 decades later, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the closest advisor to the Prussian king, undertook to unite the German states. For the flimsiest of reasons, a coalition of German states went to war against France and won. In 1871, the Prussian king was crowned German emperor in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The German Empire had finally been created. A cheering crowd greeted the triumphant new emperor when he rode into Berlin through the Brandenburg Gate. 17 years later, in March 1888, Wilhelm I died, shortly before his 91st birthday. Berlin was in mourning. The old Kaiser had become a living legend and was admired by his people. A banner that read, "Farewell, Old Emperor," was hung from the gate, which was draped in black. The Kaiser's death marked the end of an era. During the reign of Wilhelm I, Berlin had grown into a thriving capital city. Wilhelm was succeeded by his son Friedrich III. The map of Europe would certainly look quite different today if this peace-loving and liberal monarch had lived as long as his father. But Frederick was already suffering from cancer when he was crowned, and after just 99 days, he died. He, in turn, was succeeded by his son, an immature young man who would remain German emperor for 3 decades, Wilhelm II. At the time, Berliners often said they wanted their old Kaiser Wilhelm back, meaning the grandfather of Wilhelm II, who was cast in a very different mold.
I consider that I am always mindful of the fact that the eyes of my ancestors look down upon me from the world beyond, and that I shall one day have to be answerable to them for ensuring the renown and the honor of the German army.
This early film footage shows the Kaiser riding through the central portal of the Brandenburg Gate, which was reserved for the royal family. The Kaiser liked to ride around in fine carriages, hold receptions and court ceremonies, attend gala dinners, and sport his many uniforms. There were plenty of occasions for pomp and for the military parades he so relished. When he assumed the throne, Wilhelm II made grandiose promises to the people, declaring, "I will lead you into glorious times," to which the skeptical reply was, "Thanks, but we'd rather go alone." At the start of the 20th century, Berliners would ride through the Tiergarten Park to the west of the Brandenburg Gate in horse-drawn carriages. Cars were still a rarity, and traffic congestion still unknown here. In 1910, the gate could only be passed on foot. In 1913, the last year before the Great War, the Kaiser had 6 grown sons, and the dynasty appeared to be in good shape. Then suddenly, on June 28, 1914, the Austrian heir apparent, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo. Perhaps Germany could have stayed out of the brewing conflict and urged its ally Austria to take diplomatic rather than military steps. But Kaiser Wilhelm and his generals evidently didn't want to stay out. They'd already built up the armed forces. In August 1914, Germany was at war with Great Britain, France, and then also Russia. It was soon fighting on 3 fronts. Tens of thousands of men were called up across Germany. The mood was, for the most part, one of enthusiasm. Germans hadn't lost a battle for 100 years, and many people were confident that the generals knew what they were doing. They were wrong.
Now it is that sword that will decide. In the midst of peace, the enemy attacks us. Therefore, to arms! We shall prevail in this battle, even against a world of enemies.
In 1914, nobody could have imagined that 10 million people were to die in this entirely pointless war, or that everything they'd believed in, honor, duty, loyalty, and patriotism, would be rendered hollow. Although Germany lost the war, returning soldiers were greeted by cheering crowds at the Brandenburg Gate. After years of misery and hunger, all the people now wanted was peace. On the 9th of November 1918, it was announced the Kaiser had abdicated, and the social democratic politician Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed a new German republic. But there was no government. The red flag flew from the Brandenburg Gate. The communists set up workers' and soldiers' councils. Their aim was to transform Germany into a communist republic, modeled on Lenin's Soviet system. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats created a provisional government they called the Council of People's Commissars, and succeeded in crushing the communist revolt. In 1919, the Social Democrat Friedrich Ebert was elected president of Germany. What the new republic now needed was a constitution. Revolutionary socialist sailors patrolled the square beneath the Brandenburg Gate, Pariser Platz. The idea was, whoever controls the gate controls Berlin, and whoever has Berlin has Germany. The Spartacist League encouraged an armed revolt. Fighters with submachine guns seized the Brandenburg Gate and took up position behind the goddess of peace. The revolt was put down in a week. In early March, the gate was once again in the hands of government troops. But right-wing forces were also threatening the young republic. In March 1920, rightist officers, a Freikorps unit, marched into Berlin through the Brandenburg Gate. Their declared goal was to topple the Social Democratic government. The army refused the government's order to put down what came to be known as the Kapp Putsch, saying German soldiers do not shoot other German soldiers. For 5 long days, there was an uneasy calm around the Brandenburg Gate. But in the face of a general strike, the putsch collapsed. The new decade, the 1920s, was marked by extremes. Famine, unemployment, and massive inflation provoked protests and demonstrations in Berlin, as did anger at the massive reparations demanded of Germany by the countries that had won the war. Perhaps it was precisely because of such problems that people tried, as always in times of need, to repress or forget their woes. Strangely enough, the decade came to be known as the Golden Twenties. At the same time, Berlin developed into a world-class cultural metropolis. Although no one had any money, apart from the black marketeers and wheelers and dealers, the streets were suddenly full of cars. Motorists would speed through the Brandenburg Gate and into the Tiergarten Park at 40 kilometers an hour. No doubt to the amazement of the goddess. Anybody who was anybody, or thought he was, would make a point of being seen at the Brandenburg Gate. Stars and starlets swarmed to Berlin from around the world. The cabman, Iron Gustav, who'd set off for Paris in a horse-drawn carriage, enjoyed a triumphant return. In 1925, President Ebert died unexpectedly. The funeral procession for this champion of democracy passed through the Brandenburg Gate. His successor was the 77-year-old retired Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. It was a choice determined more by emotion than reason. Hindenburg was considered upright and incorruptible, and he enjoyed the respect of the military. As commander in the field, he'd won the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, but he was not an experienced politician, as would soon become painfully clear. In the late 1920s, the tensions in Berlin became ever more intense. The Great Depression saw unemployment soar. That led to a political polarization and radicalization. The Centre Party lost support, while the Communist Party gained support. Its leader Ernst ran for the presidency, but with about 10% of the vote lost to Hindenburg. About this time, a new group of men could sometimes be seen marching on Unter den Linden and through the Brandenburg Gate. The militant supporters of the new Nazi Party, led by an Austrian named Adolf Hitler. Brown shirts or stormtroopers, members of the Nazi Party's own paramilitary organization, the SA. Their standards bore a new and still unfamiliar emblem, the swastika. They were violent thugs who would attack their opponents, leftists and Jews, on the city's streets. The still obscure Mr. Hitler sent a certain Dr. Joseph Goebbels to build support for the Nazi Party in Berlin. On October 3, 1929, the foreign minister Gustav Stresemann died at the worst possible moment. He had taken Germany into the League of Nations and had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his policy of reconciliation and negotiation. The Nazi Party then had just a dozen seats in parliament, but in 1930 it won 107 seats in the Reichstag elections. It was a landslide which, strangely enough, didn't attract much attention abroad. Two years later, the Nazi Party won a third of the votes in parliamentary elections. Hindenburg came under intense pressure and eventually appointed Adolf Hitler Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, the fateful day when the Nazis took power in Germany. They put on a spectacular show that evening to mark their triumph, a huge torchlit procession through the Brandenburg Gate. They'd been planning this for a long time. Some people would later claim they didn't know back then what the Nazis really stood for, but the signs had been clear. First, the Reichstag was set on fire, then the Nazis started burning books beside the Opera House on Unter den Linden. First, they destroyed democracy, then culture and civilization. For 12 long years, countless goose-stepping marches and parades were held on the boulevard and at the Brandenburg Gate. In 1936, Berlin hosted the Summer Olympics. Germany wasn't at war, but things had changed. The city was no longer a vibrant melting pot. Discipline and dour order prevailed. The goddess of peace now looked down not on an avenue of lime trees, but on a forest of flagpoles and swastikas. The American novelist Thomas Wolfe wrote in his diary, "Despite all the pomp, there's something oppressive about the city." To mark his 50th birthday in April 1939, Adolf Hitler left his new chancellery and went to the Brandenburg Gate to take the salute at the most gigantic military parade ever. The avenue leading from the gate to Charlottenburg in the west had been widened for the occasion and renamed the East-West Axis. The Berliners had their own nickname for Hitler, Gröfatz, a shortened form of the greatest Führer of all time. It was meant ironically. The Nazis were now at the height of their power, and there was precious little evidence of resistance among the population. Hitler had, after all, reduced unemployment, built motorways, rearmed the military, and stabilized the economy. The humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles 20 years earlier had not been forgotten. The Nazis wanted to show the world that Germany could win a war. It was clear to everybody that war was imminent. Reasons for conflict were concocted to disguise, at least for the moment, Hitler's true aim, to seize control first of Europe, then the world. And the rest of the world did little to stop him. Czechoslovakia became a German protectorate. Austria was annexed outright. Hitler claimed the free city of Gdansk or Danzig for Germany. The goddess on the gate now waved a flag bearing a swastika. An entire generation would later try to forget such images and memories. After the war, hardly anyone owned up to having voted for Hitler. 10 years later, Germany would be split into two states. In post-war Germany, where the eagle remained a respected national symbol, old Nazis would enjoy successful careers. In East Germany, where the struggle against fascism was central to state doctrine, fascist rituals lived on. The Nazi salute would be replaced by the proletarian clenched fist, each a meaningless gesture. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland without warning.
November 1918 will never be repeated in German history. Any hope of undermining our people is naive. Mr. Churchill may be convinced that Great Britain will prevail. I do not doubt for 1 second that Germany will prevail.
Ich zweifle keine Sekunde, dass Deutschland siegt.
In the first 3 years of World War II, Germany conquered half of Europe and, through merciless aerial bombardment, destroyed dozens of cities. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, seemed to be unbeatable. Then in 1942, the United States joined the war. The tide turned against Germany with its defeat at Stalingrad. In June 1944, American and British troops landed on France's Normandy coast. German cities had already been subjected to aerial bombardment for a year. Now they faced systematic destruction by the Allies. In February 45, the Americans crossed the Rhine heading east. By then, much of Berlin had already been reduced to rubble. People in Germany had little idea what it was like at the front. Goebbels' propaganda ministry kept the press under tight control. The papers were still promising victory as the Allies were marching on Berlin. Also that February, the Nazis put on their last macabre procession through the Brandenburg Gate. Only a few diehards still clung to the prospect of victory. For the people of Berlin, the last 2 years of the war were terrible enough, but they would soon experience losing the war as a catastrophe. Camouflage nets on the east-west axis proved to be useless. The idea was to disorientate Allied bomber pilots. In that they failed, especially since the goddess on top of the gate showed the pilots the way. As late as April 1945, the Nazis put up anti-tank obstacles around the gate to try and stop the Soviet army from taking the city. It was an absurd gesture under the circumstances. The battle for Berlin lasted 5 days. The Nazi leadership had withdrawn to its bunker deep under the Chancellery, where Adolf Hitler continued to give mad orders. Meanwhile, on the streets, futile combat killed thousands of civilians. The Brandenburg Gate, surrounded by an apocalyptic scene. On May the 2nd, it was all over. The Brandenburg Gate had been heavily damaged, and the Quadriga almost destroyed, except for one lonely horse. Now the fighting was over, a few people ventured out onto the streets again. Suddenly that afternoon, white flags appeared at all the windows. For the next 45 years, Berlin would be under the control of the Allies, the 4 countries that had won the war. There was no time to reflect on what had happened. People were too busy just trying to get by. The Allies had liberated Germany from the Nazis, but nobody was happy about the Russians raising the red flag on the Reichstag.
The Soviet flag, the flag of victory, is flying above the Reichstag. Stalin's order has been carried out.
The scene was faked, as were the group photos in front of the Reichstag and Brandenburg Gate. Though where else should one be filmed for the people back home? The victors realized that in symbolic terms, it was more significant to take control of the Brandenburg Gate than the former royal palace. A large portrait of Stalin was installed on Unter den Linden. And who took control of the gate? The Russians, since they got there first. And at once they raised the red flag. A few days later, Marshal Zhukov of the victorious Soviet army marched through the gate. In February, before the end of the war, the Allies had agreed at the Yalta Conference that they would divide Berlin into sectors. The Soviets occupied the center and the eastern part of the city, including Unter den Linden up to the Brandenburg Gate. They installed signposts in Russian. The 3 Western Allies could divide up the rest. In the summer of 1945, the 4 Allies made a show of unity, although Stalin had already broken promises he'd made at Yalta and would later disregard agreements he'd signed at the Potsdam Conference in July and August. The 4 did agree on the need to denazify Germany. Nazi flags and propaganda were burned. That was the easy part. German children helped eagerly. It was harder to remove all the stone swastikas from facades throughout the city. In June 45, the Americans took aerial photographs of Berlin in order to take stock of the damage. A third of the buildings in the city centre around the Brandenburg Gate had been destroyed. 80% of the rest were seriously damaged. Few factories had survived the bombings, and now the industrial equipment was being dismantled and taken to the Soviet Union. Close up, the scenes were even more miserable. A herd of cows on Unter den Linden. There wasn't enough shelter or food for the people of Berlin. And the situation became even worse with the arrival of tens of thousands of Germans who'd been expelled from areas in the east now under Soviet control. They were hoping to find shelter in the capital. Although in the past Berlin had welcomed many refugees, the new arrivals were sent away. The city couldn't cope with so many people. They were just too many. Since food was scarce, Berliners started to grow their own vegetables, even in the center of the city. Cabbages were planted in the Tiergarten Park, which was looking bleak since all the trees had been cut down for firewood. But only Berliners with connections had such good fortune. You had to know someone in the town hall to get an allotment. The black market was flourishing beneath the Brandenburg Gate, of course, where else? Russians and Americans played an active role. For speculators and wheeler dealers, times were good. The favored currency was the US dollar. Nobody wanted rubles. Women fortunate enough to have any jewelry sold it. You couldn't still hunger with gold or diamonds. A flourishing black market meant economic activity was reviving. Nobody paid attention to the warning signs. Chocolate and real coffee were prime objects of desire in those days, and Lucky Strike cigarettes. The last public display of harmony among the four allies was a military parade held in 1947. The Cold War would soon change all that, and Berlin would soon be riven in two. Separate marches would then be held to the east and to the west of the unpassable Brandenburg Gate. As soon as the war was over, a single new municipal authority was created. In 1948, Ernst Reuter was elected mayor of the three western sectors of Berlin. He was a social democrat and committed anti-communist. The Soviets weren't pleased and withdrew from the joint Allied command structures. Then things all went very fast. The three Western powers rejected a Soviet proposal for a single new currency for all of Berlin and instead introduced the Deutsche mark in their sectors of the city. The Soviet occupation forces reacted swiftly by imposing a blockade of all road, rail and water connections between Berlin and the West. They also cut off the supply of electricity and coal. West Berlin and its 2 million people were to be starved into submission. West Berlin survived thanks to the determination of General Lucius B. Clay, the military governor of the US occupation zone. Almost overnight, he organized an airlift to supply West Berlin. Over the next 9 months, more than 270,000 flights delivered some 2 million tons of food and supplies to the beleaguered city. On September the 9th, 1948, 150,000 people attended a rally in front of the Reichstag. Mayor Ernst Reuter addressed the crowd.
Today is the day on which the people of Berlin raised their voice. The people of Berlin call on the entire world. You, the peoples of the world, people in America, in England, in France, and in Italy, look upon this city and acknowledge that you may not, you cannot abandon this city and its people. We have done our duty, and we will continue to do our duty. Peoples of the world, do your duty as well.
The Soviets eventually realized that their blockade was futile and called it off in May '49. 2 weeks later, the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, was established. And in October, the Democratic Republic of Germany, or East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. The division of the city appeared to be sealed. The British, French and US sectors in the west, the Soviet sector in the east. 2 currencies, 2 town councils and 2 mayors. And above all, 2 very different worldviews. 5 years after the last Nazi marches on Unter den Linden, people were again demonstrating and carrying banners along the boulevard. The period between the 2 dictatorships had evidently been too brief for an experiment in democracy. In 1951, the last remaining horse was toppled from the top of the Brandenburg Gate. Only the red flag of world revolution was to fly from its crown, but it wouldn't do so for long. On June the 17th, 1953, 2 East Berlin workers climbed the gate and tore down the flag. Those watching from the western side realized that something was in the air. The day before, building workers in the east of the city had gone on strike in protest at wage cuts and an increase in the workload. The 2 men who tore down the red flag were honored by the watching crowd. The flag was ripped up and burned. When the 2 returned to East Berlin, they were arrested by officials of the State Security Service, the Stasi. But theirs had been a liberating gesture. That same afternoon, tens of thousands of angry people gathered to demand the East German government step down and call free elections. That government remained out of sight for hours. Then, in its desperation, asked the Soviet occupation force for help in crushing the rebellion. Soviet tanks advanced on the demonstrators at the Potsdamer Platz. Shots were fired. A few brave protesters threw stones at the tanks, but what use are stones against armor of steel? Hundreds of people were wounded and dozens killed. All people in West Berlin could do was try to catch a glimpse of what was going on in the east. Intervention was impossible. In honor of the uprising, the avenue heading west from the Brandenburg Gate was renamed the 17th of June by the West Berlin municipality. The gate itself was still open. Tourists could take the bus through it. West Berliners too, under the critical gaze of East Berlin police officers. The Cold War was growing in intensity, and the Brandenburg Gate was exactly on the frontier between the Soviet bloc and the West. One might at this time almost have thought that Berlin was a normal city, were it not for all the East German border police who, at will, would let you pass or keep you out. In 1956, the government in East Berlin decided to restore the Brandenburg Gate properly. After the war, it had only been patched up. Surprisingly, it also decided to restore the Quadriga, and submitted a polite request to West Berlin, asking if it could borrow the plaster casts of the Quadriga the Nazis had made in the 1940s. In the end, it was agreed that the horses and the goddess would be recreated in beaten copper in West Berlin. That was to be the last joint venture for 30 years. On the 1st of August 1958, the replacement sculpture was delivered, passing on the way the ruins of the Memorial Church in the heart of West Berlin. These clones of the original horses and charioteer were made by the renowned Noack foundry. The new goddess turned out to be the spitting image of her older twin sister. Heinrich Heine wrote of her, "The good lady has been through a lot, but you could never tell by looking at her, the courageous charioteer." That was in 1822. What else might he have written had he known about what was still to come? Her replacement would also witness momentous events. In the summer of 1961, tensions between the two German states were mounting. Thousands of East Germans were leaving the country each day, willing to abandon everything they possessed in order to escape from the communist regime. Most of them were young. East Germany was facing a demographic crisis. August the 13th was a summery Sunday. Many West Berliners were relaxing beside the river Havel. Many East Berliners were doing the same at the Müggelsee Lake. They had no idea what was happening. Early that morning, armed East German soldiers were posted at the Brandenburg Gate to secure the border of the German Democratic Republic, said the East German state radio. Then they started to rip up the roads connecting East and West Berlin, first at the Brandenburg Gate, then all along the internal border. Thousands of West Berliners rushed to the gate, and they couldn't believe their eyes. A barrier, a wall was going up right through their city. There were no protests. The mood was one of sullen anger and dismay, helplessness, paralysis. People felt resistance would be no use. What could have been going on in the hearts and minds of the men who built the wall? By the afternoon of August the 13th, West Berlin was surrounded by a barbed wire barrier. 1 week later, the stretch of concrete wall in front of the Brandenburg Gate was completed. The border of the GDR had now been secured.
Berlin expects more than words. Berlin expects political action. Our fellow countrymen are looking to us at this hour. We know that it is only the tanks that are holding them back from expressing their outrage. They are asking whether we have written them off. To that there is only one answer. No, never.
these images were shown all around the world. A woman and her daughter say goodbye. Just two of the countless people to be torn apart, separated from their family and friends. The wall blocked streets. It ran through the middle of buildings and, horribly, was matched by a wall in the minds and hearts of the people on both sides. It would prove harder to destroy that mental barrier than the physical wall that cut Berlin in two. That wall would be torn down 28 years later. Why, future generations may ask, was there so little resistance? What should people have done? One can't win against stupidity coupled with power. In West Berlin, people took to the streets and called on the three Western occupying powers to act. Especially US President John F. Kennedy. He chose not to come to Berlin, but he did send his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Kennedy didn't want to start a third world war, and Berlin is a long way from Washington. Kennedy visited West Berlin 2 years later. In his famous speech in front of Schöneberg Town Hall, Kennedy offered moral support, but nothing more.
While the wall is the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system, for all the world to see, we take no satisfaction in it, for it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
As West Berlin faced increasing isolation, Kennedy's words meant a lot to its people. He was taken to inspect the Brandenburg Gate. The East German government had hung red fabric from the gate for the occasion. The gate stood in the very heart of the city, and at the same time in no man's land, presiding over a concrete wall and a death strip sown with landmines. The gate's architect, Langhans, had designed it to be as open as possible. It would remain entirely closed for more than 28 years. "193 people were shot and killed trying to escape over the Berlin Wall. Only rabbits could roam the death strip. From West Berlin, one could look between the columns and see the cars on Unter den Linden. Foreign visitors to West Berlin were often taken to the raised stand in front of the gate, and they all asked the same question. Don't you feel caged in here, surrounded by a wall? And the West Berliners' standard answer was, no, not at all. The wall is simply there, and there's nothing we can do about it. Did they really believe what they were saying? The wall was a trauma few could deal with emotionally. It was too painful and too horrible. On August the 13th, 1986, East Germany celebrated the 25th anniversary of the building of the wall, or as they put it, the securing of the state border of the German Democratic Republic. East German leader and Communist Party boss Erich Honecker and his comrades were clearly proud of themselves and their republic.
One can claim with satisfaction that by constructing the anti-fascist protective barrier, we have ensured the protection of our anti-imperialistic achievements, the socialist achievements of the workers' and farmers' state, and we have also made a great contribution to peace.
The aged leader was clearly out of touch. A short time earlier, a visitor from Moscow had inspected the Brandenburg Gate. The ideas he'd brought with him were glasnost and perestroika, openness and restructuring. US President Ronald Reagan took Gorbachev at his word.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
The crowd may have cheered, but most West Berliners probably remained skeptical. And in fact, nothing did change in East Germany. On the contrary, in October '89, the East German leaders celebrated the 40th birthday of their state the way they saw fit. But military parades and glasnost don't go together. Gorbachev wasn't enthusiastic.
Do you think the situation in the GDR is dangerous? No, I don't think so. Dangers lurk only for those who fail to respond to life's challenges.
The authorities staged a torchlit procession on Unter den Linden that evening, but amazingly enough, dissenting voices could be heard. "Gorby, help us," they shouted, and no violence. That day marked the start of East Germany's peaceful revolution. Security officials detained a few demonstrators, but just 4 weeks later they no longer stood a chance. Instead of a few hundred, tens of thousands demonstrated. Faced with their chant, "We are the people," the government fell silent. The Brandenburg Gate on the 9th of November 1989. The media were reporting that the East German authorities had opened the country's borders. But the gate wasn't a border crossing. Nonetheless, people climbed here onto the wall. And not even water cannon could deter them, or stem the tide of history. About midnight, hundreds of people climbed onto the wall, and thousands more gathered beneath it. Berliners from the east and the west. Some had brought along pickaxes and started chipping away at the concrete. On the east side, police blocked off the Brandenburg Gate. It was, after all, not a border crossing. But one woman would not accept no for an answer.
Just once in my life, I want to walk through the Brandenburg Gate and see the other side. I've never been there. Is that so hard for you to understand? I don't understand.
Go to the border crossing. Let her through. Let her cross.
Finally, the policeman and the woman went through the gate together, arm in arm. It would be several weeks before the first section of wall came down at the gate. On the 22nd of December, just in time for Christmas, a crane removed 5 segments. The sons tore down what their fathers had built. The graffiti-covered concrete panels became collector's items, works of art and historical artifacts at the same time. Companies and individuals around the world paid thousands to acquire a piece of the Berlin Wall. Eastern police officers took photos of their Western counterparts. You'd have to be a Berliner to realize just how incredible that was. It must have been the rainiest day of the year. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, accompanied by East German Prime Minister Hans Modrow, walked through the gate from west to east.
Dear Berliners, the Brandenburg Gate has just been opened to pedestrians.
People who 3 months earlier were convinced the wall was there for all eternity ran through the Brandenburg Gate like happy children. On that day, the 22nd of December 1989, Berliners who rarely show much emotion in public were visibly and publicly ecstatic. Tears and raindrops mingled on many a cheek. On New Year's Eve, 300,000 people gathered at the Brandenburg Gate. The finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with its ode to joy and freedom rang out over Pariser Platz. The goddess, however, wasn't looking very festive. All the leaves had been stolen from her laurel wreath. It was time for some major cosmetic surgery. By contrast, this kind of destruction was most welcome. The woodpecker diligence of the public meant that later the professional demolition crews had much less to do. The stretch of wall between the gate and the Reichstag building was soon full of holes. As the East German state fell apart, the market in East German memorabilia boomed. Army helmets, caps and uniforms went like hot cakes in West Berlin. On the other side, the tourist business, organized sightseeing trips, started to develop. The goddess on the gate would witness plenty more changes, probably not all to her liking. But what of the goddess? She was to spend a year being restored to her original beauty. While she was in the clinic for damaged goddesses, a living double took over. The two German states were by now planning unification celebrations. It was, of course, obvious where they should be held. On the 3rd of October, Unter den Linden was packed with Germans and visitors from all over the world. The joy was accompanied by warnings about a revival of German nationalism. But the worst fears of some foreign observers have so far proved to be unfounded. Perhaps the Germans have learnt something from their history. The goddess was now restored to health, and it was time for her to return to her place of honor, along with her chariot and her horses. She was no longer Nike, the goddess of victory, but once again Irene, the goddess of peace. As she had 33 years earlier after her last restoration, she again rode past landmarks that still bear the traces of the past and where the scars have not yet healed. A century ago, an art historian described the goddess's chariot as a fighting vehicle, and her friendly-faced steeds as war horses. She has always reserved judgment and looked down impassively. From that height, human activity must look quite different. The restorers gave back to the goddess her eagle and her iron cross, which may not have been a good idea. They're both symbols of discredited and dangerous ideologies. The Quadriga and the gate were originally meant to represent the victory of peace over war. 2 centuries later, it looked as if the chances for at least some years of peace were relatively good. A pious wish uttered in August 1991 to mark the gate's 200th birthday, 10 months after German unification. In the early 90s, almost 5 decades after the end of World War II, the Brandenburg Gate still stood alone in a large stretch of wasteland between the Tiergarten Park to the west and Unter den Linden to the east. There was still something crucial missing on Pariser Platz, the once elegant square right beside the gate: buildings. And then, at last, construction began in 1993 on the first new building on the square, the Hotel Adlon. Tourist buses had to edge cautiously past all the cranes, bulldozers and concrete mixers at the site. For the next decade, Pariser Platz and the gate would be one enormous building site, further congested by heavy traffic and lots of tourists. Reconstructing the heart of Berlin, including this most prestigious square, proved difficult and complicated. The politicians discussed what kind of architecture was appropriate. The city drew up guidelines. Competitions were held to find the best designs. Some argued the new Berlin should be closely modeled on the old Berlin. Others called for boldness and innovation. The result has been a mix, a collage. One immutable rule at the Pariser Platz was that no new building may be taller than the Brandenburg Gate. The obligatory artworks are mostly on the inside. Where proud Prussian mansions once stood, banal buildings in the spirit of prosaic pragmatism now line the square. Major banks occupy the buildings to the immediate north and south of the gate. Such expensive real estate is out of the reach of most companies and individuals. The new Hotel Adlon is twice as big as and taller than the pre-war Adlon, and claims, like its predecessor, to be the best address in town. The turn of the millennium saw the start of a hotel construction boom in Berlin. The Four Seasons, Ritz-Carlton, the Esplanade and Hilton. The old names are back. But none can boast the views the Adlon enjoys of the Brandenburg Gate. The rich, the glamorous, and above all the powerful have always been drawn to the Pariser Platz, and they all make a point of walking through the gate. Queen Elizabeth II, for example, who 35 years earlier had seen the wall in the same spot. Or Pope John Paul II, who stopped his Pope-mobile to walk those few steps. Or Russian President Vladimir Putin, who put on the charm. Or French President Jacques Chirac, who shook hands with the locals. The Brandenburg Gate is on every dignitary's itinerary. US President George Bush wanted to see where the wall had stood. He's reported to have murmured, "It's incredible." The Gate also attracts people whose views on democracy, human rights and terrorism are very different from those of George Bush. Frederick the Great, the champion of tolerance, might have said, "Everyone may demonstrate here as he sees fit." Sometimes it's leftists who demonstrate here, and sometimes it's right-wingers. But whatever their cause, they all pass through the gate, where the chances are good they might be captured on video by a TV crew.
Nazis raus! Nazis raus!
On such occasions, the police are always sure to be out in force. In July, when, by contrast, the weather is almost always good, hundreds of thousands of young ravers converge on Berlin for the annual Love Parade, a world-class techno street party. The 17th of June street is packed as they dance for hours to the insistent booming bass beats. Here too, the goddess on the gate retains her equanimity, confident perhaps that she will outlast such strange pastimes. After the goddess had undergone her rejuvenation, in the mid-1990s it was the turn of the gate itself to be restored and treated for the ravages of time. Double-decker buses had been allowed to pass through the gate, and that did the aging structure no good at all. Nor did the building work all around it. Infrared pictures proved that a major overhaul was needed from the foundations up. Or what was left of the foundations. It turned out the proud sandstone gate was standing on a fragile base of rusting iron struts and crumbling damp bricks. It was lucky it hadn't collapsed. Tons of cement were poured into the basement to stabilize the structure. The neoclassical frieze had to be restored slowly and carefully by hand, with the help of lasers. The gate then disappeared behind sheeting for almost 3 years. Since the city had no money to pay for the expensive work, a corporate sponsor footed the bill. In exchange, it could use the gate as a huge advertising billboard. Shielded from the public gaze and the weather, the restorers filled in bullet holes and repaired the damage caused by acid rain. The sponsor dreamed up a range of motifs. Its trademark Pink Panther looking out perkily. Or twin quadrigas. Motorists rubbed their eyes in amazement as they approached the gate. The columns were suddenly leaning to one side. Or winding around each other. Or the whole gate sinking into the ground. One day the Pariser Platz was gone, replaced by the Arc de Triomphe. And 2 months later, there was the White House. The restoration was completed just in time for October the 3rd, 2002. The lifting of the veil was staged as a TV spectacle, broadcast around the world. Ski fashion designer and amateur acrobat Willy Borgner had the honor of opening the enormous zip. Within, a gleamingly refreshed and restored Brandenburg Gate. Freed of its bullet holes, patina and cracks, the gate looks as fresh as when it was built, the traces of history expunged from its surface, as if 2 world wars or the division of Germany had never happened. It was designed to be an open gate, a gate of peace. Shortly before the US attacked Iraq, an anti-war rally was held there. After all, history moves on, at the Brandenburg Gate as well. Our film ends with an event that might give encouragement to the hope that people of different cultures and religions can learn to live together. Germany's first ecumenical church congress was held in Berlin in the summer of 2003, with the aim of bringing together Protestants, Catholics and Orthodox Christians across denominational lines.
Und wirkt in dir und wirkt in mir. Heiliger Geist, wer kommt hier gleich?
The Congress involved an implicit protest against Vatican doctrine, and more generally, against the idea that any doctrine of faith may be handed down by a church authority. The overall message of the meeting was that only if we cooperate with each other and treat people who have different ideas and beliefs with respect and tolerance, does humankind stand a chance of survival. Only if you understand history can you learn from it. For 2 centuries now, the Brandenburg Gate has been the scene of history in the making. Patriotism, victory, and defeat. Putsch and general strike. Mourning processions. And torchlit parades. Demonstrations of mass support and power staged by the dictatorship. Followed by destruction, occupation, and foreign rule. A workers' revolt, crushed by Soviet tanks. The Cold War. And the Berlin Wall, which divided the city for almost 3 decades. The Brandenburg Gate was an ideological eye of the needle, on the front line between the great power blocks, on the scene between 2 antagonistic ideologies. Then came Gorbachev, bearing the promise of Glasnost, and Reagan's call for him to make good that promise and open the gate. On the 9th of November 1989, the division of Germany was overcome. That New Year's Eve at the Brandenburg Gate was one of those rare ecstatic moments in history when the vision of Schiller's ode to joy and freedom appeared to find fulfillment. And then in October 1990 came political reunification, accompanied by the solemn pledge that Germany would never start a war again. We end our film with scenes from a day on which people of good heart from all over the world and widely differing cultures came together to pray for peace and tolerance. And if anyone can testify to just how difficult a task that continues to be, it's the silent charioteer atop the Brandenburg Gate, who is not Nike, goddess of victory, but Irene, goddess of peace.